Right, thank you all for joining us today. I think there's a few more just joining, but I think most people are here now. So today we are going to look at ELS Under Inspection. Tara Dodson, who is one of the authors of ELS, is going to talk to you about what Ofsted inspectors might look for in an inspection, and go into bits of detail about what you would need to know, and some really useful questions that you might get asked. So I'm going to hand over to Tara now. She's going to take you through this.
Thank you. So yes, we're going to look at ELS under inspection. I was saying to Karra and the team at OUP before, this is it's not the jolliest of sessions because it is quite serious, but hopefully you will find all of the information that I share really useful and pertinent and relevant. And so, with no mistaking what the intention of this session is, let's dive into ELS under inspection. So everything that I've taken here is from the Inspection Framework and Handbook. So in primary schools and infant, junior, lower middle schools, inspectors will always carry out a deep dive into reading and deep dives into one or more foundation subjects. And in addition, inspections will often carry out a deep dive in maths. That's the statement that's taken. It should be that the person who does your deep dive into early reading also does your deep dive into English if you have multiple inspectors. So just that's something to be aware of, that it should be the same person. Other inspections in infant, junior, primary and lower middle schools, inspectors will carry out a deep dive into working out how well children are taught to read, and they'll pay particular attention to the pupils who need the most help to improve their reading, the lowest 20%, and that will support them to assess how well the school is teaching phonics and supporting all children to become fluent and confident readers. So when they're reaching their evaluation against the quality of education judgment, they're going to be making lots of judgments based on some of these statements. And this you can find on the Ofsted, on the inspection handbook. It talks about whether all pupils are going to learn to read, regardless of their background. That's one we hear often. Thinking about which stories, poems, rhymes, non-fiction texts are chosen to develop pupils' understanding of vocabulary and language. How your school's phonic programme meets or exceeds the expectations of the national curriculum and the early learning goals, and that your school's got clear expectations of your pupils' progress term by term, which we provide with our curriculum. In the handbook, you've got that progression map that matches to each week of teaching. That you've got a sequence of reading books that show a cumulative progression in phonics knowledge that's closely matched to the school's phonics programme, and you have those texts that are matched by OUP there. And that it gives your pupils sufficient practice in reading, and that those books are therefore matched to their phonic knowledge. You include the teaching of systematic synthetic phonics, and it's taught from the beginning of reception. We also know from the framework and from the guidance that we shouldn't be waiting until the baseline at the beginning of reception is complete. We should be teaching phonics from the first weeks of primary. So actually you need to start teaching before you finished completing that. Which means that you should start teaching, in the second week, third week at the absolute latest. And you will obviously need to work around if you have a softer start at the beginning of term, how you're going to manage that so that you begin teaching pupils as quickly as possible. And then making sure that the ongoing assessment is frequent enough and that the school has developed sufficient expertise in the teaching of phonics and reading. So at that point, I'm just going to make it a given that you do need to complete the training, and that you need to maintain your training so that you can update your CPD throughout your teaching year and going forwards. You'll have teachers that will move year groups, you'll have new members of staff to the school. You must maintain your level of training as part of your normal CPD practices. So that's a non-negotiable. Training has to happen. And as we go through this, you're going to see how important training actually is. So the ELS physical resources that you're going to need in your school to be able to teach ELS well are and I've picked the essential blending books, the essential phonic readers, but obviously there is a much wider book stock that OUP do sell that matches ELS. You've got your online teaching subscription. You have your grapheme cards, whether they're the small cards or the large cards. You have the spelling poster that goes with your reception teaching class pack and your year one teaching class pack. You've got the ELS apply activity books, sound mats if you've opted to buy those in colour, wall freezers, again, they come in small and large. And if you've chosen to purchase it for your school, you have the ELS ebook library. All of these resources work in harmony as part of the programme to deliver to your children the knowledge that we're imparting through ELS, but the opportunity to independently apply their understanding, where they take ownership, for example, of their learning is in that apply activity book and throughout the practice and apply parts of the lesson where you're asking them to be more independent. And they also get to take ownership of their own reading when they're reading an ebook or when they're reading one of the physical books that matches the programme. That's their independent application. They're showing their phonic knowledge and phonic understanding. So you're going to hear me say these things quite a few times throughout this session. Some of the things I'll say as I go through, there are lots of different things that we're going to look at, and you will hear me repeat some of the same things. If you do not have a pen and paper with you right now, I strongly recommend that you get one at this point, because we're about to launch into looking at all the different questions that you could be asked by your inspector, questions that have been asked by inspectors, and thinking about not just what the ELS response is, but also what your own school's response is, what you want to share with the inspector when they ask you these questions. Then when we've gone through all of these questions and thought about how ELS how ELS answers these questions, how you can prove or how you can state what evidence you might have or what evidence you might want to gather to share, we're then going to look at some inspection reports, and I've broken them down into the component parts of the comments that you get, so we can think about how in your own practice and in your own building, how you are exemplifying and showing these things. Because at the end of the day, you do this 2-day inspection, we know it's a deep dive into early reading, and you get 6 or 7 sentences. And that's all that sums up all your hard work and effort. So we want to make every second that we are with that inspector count, but also make sure that we share all of the understanding that we have as the reading or phonics leader. So, talk to me about reading. This is often what an inspector will ask you. Talk to me about reading. And at this point, I recommend you start talking and you do not stop speaking until they ask you to pause so that they can write down some of what you're saying. Naturally, as you're talking about things, you will remind yourself of other things as well. So the beauty of kind of having an opportunity to have a monologue about early reading is that you will start to remind yourself of other things that you do. But it's good to have some bullet points just for reference. And you are allowed to take information in with you. There will be questions they'll ask where, they want to see the progression, they'll want to see different parts. It's good to have the handbook if you've got a folder and you can have some kind of key talking points that you want to make sure that you communicate. You are allowed to refer to the documents that you have. But yeah, they will ask you to talk to them about reading. And forgive me for the many, many, many questions I'm about to show you. This session will be recorded and you are then able to go back and watch it again if you want to. But for each of these, I'm going to talk about how ELS would answer these questions, how Katie and I would answer them, how we have answered them in inspections, before I then go into looking at those comments that were made on 2 different Ofsted reports. I've pulled some comments to have a look at. So, how do you ensure the teaching of early reading is prioritised? This is a key question, and there are so many parts to the answer of this question. And so by starting to talk about the answer to this question, you're actually going to start answering lots of the other questions as well. But if they do ask you, how do you ensure teaching of early reading is prioritised? You can say it's a whole school priority. Every single member of staff in the building needs to have been trained. So they should be trained. And if you know that that's not the case, change that in the very short future. Make that a priority to change it so that you know that every single person in that building has been shown how to teach early reading, has been shown how to teach phonics. That is part of prioritising it. Giving it enough time in your timetable. Is that adequate time to teach reading in your timetable? Have you given enough time in your timetable for the teaching of early reading? That's another part of showing that you're prioritising that element of your practice. Making sure that you're identifying pupils that are falling behind and that you're supporting them, and that you are taking the time that that child needs if they need intervention outside of the class time. That's part of prioritising early reading. Finding out where every child is, knowing what every child's next step is. Those are all the ways, just of the, before we've even dived into any of the other questions that are here, those are just some top headlines about how we're making sure that it's prioritized. You are well resourced. You have the books that match the program. Your reading books have been matched to the progression of the program. All teachers know what they should be teaching when. You have a phonics policy that you are following. You have the progression map that you are using. Children and teachers can talk about what happens in their ELS lessons. You know, they might ask a pupil, what are you going to be asked to do in this lesson? Prioritizing it would be that the child is able to talk to you about what's going on, because they'll know, because they're part of that every day. How does reading, although this one doesn't technically fit in with ELS, I just think it's a really pertinent question. How does reading fit with the wider curriculum? As you will know, if you've ever been to any session with Katie and I, we always talk about how if you cannot read, you cannot access the wider curriculum in the way that you intend it. Because if you can read well, you've got better access to language and vocabulary understanding, which means you can read more easily, which means you'll gain more access to vocabulary and knowledge, which means that in your wider curriculum, you're going to have better understanding, better background knowledge, better vocabulary understanding, so that you can access more and understand more of what's going on. But outside of that, your reading curriculum, the one where you've decided which texts your children are reading in those reading lessons, which texts you are reading to the children, if you've got protected time, which you fingers crossed should have in your timetable for sharing books with the children at the end of the day, inspiring that love of reading, that those texts have been carefully matched to and support and develop children's understanding of your wider curriculum as well. You know, if you're teaching a history topic on war, for example, you could be reading a book like Good Night, Mr. Tom. You can carefully choose the texts that match to and support your wider curriculum. So think carefully about how your reading curriculum, although that's not part of ELS, just think carefully about how ELS provides access to your reading curriculum where you're asking children to read independently, but also that your reading curriculum does fit with and support your wider curriculum and is developing alongside your curriculum. Next one, how do you know which children are not on track with the Pace of Schools phonics programme? In the first 3 weeks of reception, we specifically designed the programme so that you can work out who is going to find it more challenging, and so that you can make sure that you are targeting those children. You have that in the lesson intervention. You've also got the one-to-one interventions that can happen outside of the classroom. In the day-to-day teaching of ELS, you should be making assessments within the lesson about which children are understanding what you're teaching and which children are going to need additional support to get to the outcome, which is learning that GPC. And that's where on a day-to-day basis, you can be reactive. So you can be tracking what's going on in your classroom. I always say that the children tell you the story of the learning. So you can be checking out within the lesson which children are not on track. So you can be then making sure that they stay with you for that in the lesson intervention, or making sure in those first 3 weeks of reception that you're identifying those pupils early on, because it might be something like they can't consistently say the sound. They can't point to a grapheme and say the sound that you've just taught them. Whatever it is that's showing you that they are not on track, you need to be aware of that in the moment. But equally, in week 5, we do an assessment. The assessment is rigorous. It's matched to the teaching that's just taken place. It gives you the opportunity to see whether children can recognise that GPC in isolation, but it also gives you the opportunity to see whether children are blending with that GPC in words. So you've got that as well. So if you haven't picked up on a child, if someone's fallen through the net, if you haven't noticed that they're not on track in those lessons, that you haven't looked at their apply activity book for 5 weeks, which fingers crossed you really have, you have got that assessment point to make sure explicitly what every single child knows, so you know what the next step would be. Which leads into the how quickly do you spot children not keeping up with the phonics programme? Well, we should be spotting them every day. If there's a gap, if it's not closing for that child, if you can see them in the lesson and you're at the decode and blending the words and the apply and practice, and they are not decoding and blending, or they are copying what the child next to them says, or if you look at them and you're doing the flashcard review and they're not saying the sound, or you've hidden the new flashcard in the pack and they haven't shown you that they've spotted it when it comes up, you have lots and lots and lots of opportunities in the lesson to spot those children not keeping up with the phonics programme. But you also then have the apply activity books. We are the only programme that has a direct phonics matched text to every day of teaching. It's like our unique selling point. You know, if I had to pick my number one thing that made us special and different, that would be it. We've given you a text for every single day of teaching. So every single day of teaching, you're asking children to go away and independently apply their understanding. Yes, you've modelled it for them. Yes, you've given them the access. Yes, you've shown them how to be successful. But you can see in that text if they're able to apply that understanding independently. And if you've got another adult in the room who is supporting those children doing the texts, and they spot that that child is not ready to read that text independently, they can send them back to the carpet to do the in the lesson intervention with you. Like, we can be that reactive. How quickly can we spot it? We should be spotting it during the lesson, but we also can be spotting it in the apply activities. But if not, we can spot it, if you're on your own and then having a quick look through the books at the end of the day, you can spot it then. But equally, if for whatever reason this child has masked their GPC lack of knowledge from you like a master, and it gets to that assessment point in week 5, you have that assessment then that you can use to support you. How does your phonics program or curriculum help you to achieve your results? Well, I broke this down actually, and I counted up how many opportunities there are for review, and there's 215 review lessons throughout the ELS program, which is made of 360 lessons in total. So there is an awful lot of review, which means there is an awful lot of opportunity for you to make sure that the children in your classroom know what they should know. For example, at the end of spring 1, when we finish teaching phase 2 and phase 3, there are 7 weeks where we do absolutely nothing new. We just review everything that we've already done before. And a further 6 weeks where we focus on the ED word endings and we look at different word structures. There are no new GPCs taught for, 13 weeks. There are 13 weeks. Almost as many weeks as have been in the school year already. 13 weeks where there is no new content, 13 weeks where you can make sure that every child in that classroom has closed their phase 2 and phase 3 gaps. That's going to help us to achieve our results, because then our children are going to be exceeding that early learning goal. We know that if we meet our early learning goal for literacy and language, we are 11 times more likely to reach the Key Stage 2 outcome for maths. Reading really does underpin everything. So having a phonics program that allows you the opportunity to consolidate children's knowledge through extensive review, which is what we've done, 2/3 of the program are reviewing basically, that the children are going to be able to master that curriculum, which is in turn going to make them better readers. When Katie and I wrote ELS, we didn't write it so that you'd all pass a phonics screening check. Yes, obviously we want you to pass it, because, you know, it would be bad if you didn't. But we didn't write it so you'd pass the PSC. We wrote it so that children would learn to read. That's the intention. That's the purpose behind it. It's that we want children to be able to read, to enjoy reading, be able to apply their understanding, and to read well, so that then that makes the rest of everything else a lot easier if your children know how to read. And then it gives them the best access to everything else. What plans do you have to improve next year? If you've had an Evolve day, that's perfect, because you've got a roadmap of where you're going. You've sat down with one of our experts, one of our trainers, and you've looked at what practices in your school now and how you want to improve on it next year. And it might be that you want to look at the outcomes for your children. It might be that you want to look at your lowest 20%. It might be that you want to look at how, as a reading team, you deliver teaching of early reading. It might be that you want to improve on practice as a team, practice sessions. It might be that you want to improve on your monitoring cycle. There can be so many different things for how you intend to improve it. It might be that you already do really well. You get great PSC results. You know, I was speaking to a school the other day where they got consistently over 90% in the phonics screening check before taking on ELS. And the way that they can talk about how it's improved the practice within their school is that now they have far more children scoring 38, 39 and 40 on the phonics screening check than they did before. Children were passing on the line, but now those children are actually reading more words. They're more able readers. That's the big thing that they can talk about, the improvement that they've been on with the programme. So thinking about what your practice was like before, how ELS has supported you to improve your practice in delivering the curriculum programme, but equally, like, what is your next step? Is it that actually, because you're at PSC and because the children are reading more words in that PSC and maybe getting higher scores overall, is it that it's going to improve your Key Stage 1 reading outcomes? More children are going to meet that expected standard. Think carefully about what the plans are for the following year as well, so you can talk about where you are on this journey to kind of reading perfection, which we're all striving for but probably never achieving, because there's always going to be, it's always a real life situation, and children do not always learn in the way that we would love them to learn, which means that, we are always constantly striving to improve on what we've already done. Carrying on, how do you make sure that all children learn letter, diagraph and trigraph sounds? Well, these are all taught within the programme. The letter names, as we refer to them, like A, B, C, D, we do encourage that you hold off teaching them for as long as possible. I would recommend that the summer one of reception is a good time to introduce them when you're doing lots and lots and lots of spelling with the children, when they're using those ED word endings and writing the words in that right word section of the lesson. It's a good opportunity to tell the children how to spell the sounds with both the diagraphs, trigraphs, and then the pure sounds, but equally with the letter names as well. So you're starting to build that into their conscious. Diagraph and trigraphs, we start teaching them when we teach double S, double F, double L in what is the phase 2 content. So there's lots of opportunities, and we make sure that the children learn them there, and then we are consolidating them. You only need to know up to 10 diagraphs to meet your early learning goals, and you've achieved that by autumn 2, week 2. So we've been doing it from the very beginning. How do we teach children to blend those sounds into words? We model blending in every lesson. Whether it's us modelling it the whole way through and children are joining in, whether it's us giving some scaffolded support and the children are doing some work for themselves, whether it's us supporting children with more challenging words and they're doing 90% of the work on their own. But we are teaching blending from the very, very beginning. We do oral blending in every single lesson. We know that oral blending is fundamental in terms of a skill towards blending sounds into words when we're decoding and blending. So oral blending appears in every single lesson throughout the programme. And we strongly recommend, and if you've listened to our training, which fingers crossed you have, that you encourage oral blending in your wider classroom environment, particularly in reception, because for some children, this will be the first time they've ever been asked to do it. And it can be simple things like come and sit on the at. It's time to go and get your oat. You can do things like this in your wider environment. I was writing some planning for a school the other day, and I went through all their continuous provision planning for the whole of spring term and pulled out 8 words for them to practice oral blending with the children every day. And lots of those words came up time and time and time again because it matched their curriculum. But it was just kind of taking off that, removing that element of having to think about it, so it can just be natural for the adults that are in those rooms coming in contact with those children. Right, we're doing space. We're looking at this activity over here. Here are some words that we could orally blend to support the children with this activity, but equally to develop that oral blending skill that's going to ready them to blend sounds into words. How are we making sure that they all read the common exception words? We teach harder to read and spell words as part of the programme. Common exception words, some of them are decodable as part of ELS as well. The harder to read and spell words, we teach those in every single lesson. We review those in every single lesson. The 4 words are always in the same place on the whiteboard. The idea being is that the first time you might need to glance at where they are, but the second time when you give them to the children out of order, you can be looking at them, who is recognising these words, who is saying them correctly, pointing to them the last time when it's out of order and you do not give them at the first, you don't give them to them the third time it's all on the kids. This is your opportunity to assess who knows these words. Who do I need to support? Which word needs extra help? I'm going to review these throughout the day. I'm going to review them at the end of the lesson. Letter formation is taught as part of as part of ELS. When phonics programs were validated, you're only allowed to teach print because that's what we read in print. And so the letter formation is print. And so we teach that every single day that we teach. There's the opportunity for you to review it in every single lesson if you want to. You might not need to in year 1, but there is letter formation taught as part of the pure sounds, the single letter sounds. And then when you go into digraphs and trigraphs, particularly in reception, you're going to want to use those letter formation rhymes and mnemonics to support you. And to spell, ELS is not a spelling program. The phonics program is not a spelling program, although we do an awful lot of spelling as part of it. And I was talking to Katie the other day about year 1 curriculum for spelling. We actually cover almost all of the requirements for the year 1 curriculum for spelling as well, because we are making that link between sound and print and the opportunity to spell those words that we're teaching as part of the programme as well. But so outside of that, you'll also want to be making sure that your children are being taught to spell in year 1. But then if you're moving into year 2, you've obviously got ELS Essential Spelling that you can be using, which matches the children's current knowledge and is meeting the requirements of the national curriculum for year 2. What do you want your pupils to know term by term to meet the phonics screening check standard? Just for your information, that by the time you've taught year 1, spring 2, week 3, you have met the requirement for the phonics screening check. You will have covered all the possible code that could appear. So you need to teach up to that point and obviously teach the end of the term and then review everything for the phonics screening check. But you need to teach it for the children to have met the phonics screening check standard. You need to teach it so that you've met the national curriculum requirements as well. If you don't teach the alternatives in spring of year 1, if you wait, for example, as I know some schools in the past have chosen to do, you are not meeting the national curriculum expectations for your children. So you must teach the programme as intended. That's part of the fidelity, is using that progression. There are extreme circumstances under which that we might recommend you do something different, but those are school by school basis and often with the specialist settings that we work closely with. What do you want your pupils to know term by term? Well, you've got that progression document. You know what they should know based on the assessments. And then you can use your professional judgment and the guidance that we give you to decide what to do next. Whether it's that you review extensively, whether you give up a review lesson and you reteach a grapheme, depending on the number of children that do not know it maybe. Whether it's that you're reviewing that grapheme daily, you're reviewing it 3 times a week, you're reviewing it inside and outside of your lessons. You know, there's so much that we've got to teach them. It is complex, so we definitely need to be giving them the opportunity to review as frequently as possible. And when we think about the phonics screening standard, it's not very many words. You know, we're actually not asking very much of our pupils in terms of the quantity of words that we're asking them to read. So we should be able to make sure that if we are aware of what's going on in our assessments, if we're looking at the children in our lessons, we know what our progression is, we know what action to take if we spot a child who has got gaps or who needs some additional support, we can make sure that as many children as possible pass a phonics screening check. And I would suggest that you have a target. You know, we always want to be aspirational, and I suggest that you have a target that's over 90% in a phonics screening check. That should be your target, over 90%. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get 90% every year because, you know, cohort by cohort, things might change, but we want to aspire to teaching every child to read and to read well. How much time do children spend learning phonics, reading and writing? That needs to be protected in your timetable. 20 minutes to teach phonics is not long enough. It says in the framework that you should be taking up to an hour in reception to teach phonics. Our lessons are nowhere near an hour. I would recommend that children aren't sitting on the carpet for more than about 17 to 20 minutes in a phonics lesson. But outside of that, you've then got the apply activity, and you've then got ample opportunity to review. You also need to be teaching reading, and you need to be teaching writing. How do you make sure that the children's reading books help them practice the sounds that they've learnt? You're using your assessment to support you, so you know what the children can read. That needs to then be closely matched to the children's existing current phonic knowledge. So it might be that a child has remembered and retained all the GPCs that you've taught them. And so they could take home an essential blending book that matches that week of teaching. But it might be that they are able to blend more fluently, read with a higher level of fluency texts that they've had more practice of the graphemes in. So they might take home an essential blending book from this week of teaching, but they might take home another decodable text that matches ELS from a few weeks previous in their teaching to help develop that reading fluency. So children might have 2 different books in their bag serving 2 different purposes. But it's about you making sure that you know what that child knows, that that child can read that book independently. They can decode and blend the words within that book. Harder to read and spell words is a little bit tricky because they do have to learn them. And so you can remind children of harder to read and spell words when you're reading with them. But the code, they do need to be able to decode the book, which means on Fridays, when you do a review lesson or any other review lesson, that book that the children are reading with their partner needs to match their current phonic knowledge. And then it could be that book that they take home or a book in the same week of teaching that they then take home because you know that they can read it independently. How do staff increase reading fluency? This is a really big question. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around the word fluency because, you know, if I talk about a fluent reader, then that would be a child who's in, you know, year 4, year 5, year 6, who reads as if they're speaking to you in their normal speaking voice. They can understand the prose of the text. They understand the inference, the character's motivation, so that they can tell you a story and make it engaging because they understand what's happening. When we're talking about increasing reading fluency in reception in year 1 and in early reading, we're thinking about without that breaking down that need for overt decoding, so that overt sounding and blending. So that's what we're looking for at the end of Key Stage 1, isn't it? That we can read most words without overt sounding and blending. And so that comes up to practice. So how can you increase children's reading fluency? If they're struggling with consistently decoding that GPC within words. You can use a blending for reading supporting to use a blending for reading intervention to support them, but it's practice, making sure that children have ample opportunity to read. That's why there's so much reading in ELS. You know, I know the probably get asked more questions about the apply activity books than I do about anything else. But there's a reason why there's so much reading, is because that's when you're going to support reading fluency. Coming across new vocabulary, applying that phonic knowledge that you have to the words that you're then reading, and increasing your reading fluency by rereading text. That's why we say to parents to read the books 3 or 4 times. That's what's going to support increasing that reading fluency, because it's that familiarity with that code. How do you make sure staff develop the necessary expertise to teach children to read? This is the training. Number 1, it's training. Does every person in that building know how to teach reading? Do they know how to teach ELS, more importantly? It's not like, oh, I've been teaching for phonics for 20 years, I know how to teach phonics. How do they teach ELS? Because that's how to use the programme expertly to teach children how to read, is by understanding it, understanding its pedagogy, understanding how it works, understanding what the lessons look like, understanding what you're supposed to do every day, the points where you're supposed to give, the points where you're supposed to pull back. All of that comes through developing a culture of training and that culture of practice as a school. So making sure that you are able, if you're a reading lead, to go and monitor what's happening in classrooms, to go and then coach teachers if they need it in the classroom, if they need to feel more confident or want to practice a certain element of the lesson, to meet together as a reading team to talk about what's happening in the lessons, to talk about the children's outcomes, but to practice the parts of the lesson together. We talk about the practice sessions within our training, and if you aren't doing those in school, I strongly recommend that you get them up and running as soon as possible. Practicing as a team together is going to make sure that you, as the reading lead, know that everybody is doing exactly what you expect in the classroom, but equally everybody has a shared understanding of what that looks like in their own room, so that they can then go off and enact that on a daily basis, and that they feel confident in doing it. I always say to schools when I work with them, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to be part of your team. If I come into your phonics lesson, I'm sat on the carpet, I'm by your feet near the kids. I want to be part of your lesson. I want to help you. And that's what I always encourage reading leaders to do, is to build this team culture. You are all teaching the children to read. We are all responsible for this happening. Doesn't matter whether we're in early years or whether we are in year 6. Every teacher is responsible for every child learning how to read. Look at the national outcomes for Key Stage 2 reading. 74% met the expected standard, I think it was, last year. That means that nearly 30% of children went to secondary school unable to read at the expected standard for primary. That's not good enough. That means that we need to develop those expertise further. We need to support those children more, and that particularly in Key Stage 2, if we are finding that there are pupils who have struggled to learn how to read, that we are closing those gaps for them as quickly as possible. You've got ELS in Key Stage 1, but then you've got ELS Progress, which is the same content in terms of the diet of how to teach phonics, but it's got those high-low readers matched to it, so that the pupils in Key Stage 2 can continue to consolidate that phonic understanding, that phonic knowledge, that code knowledge, but with books that actually meet their age range. So they are more age-appropriate texts. And this perfectly leads on to the next one about how do you know that all staff have the same knowledge and skills? You've trained them. You know what their knowledge and skills are because you've been into those rooms, you've seen them teach, you've practiced together, you've talked about that understanding. If you have pupil progress meetings as the reading lead, go and find out about children's progress so that you can understand what's happening. If you've got pupils in classes who are weaker readers or have weaker assessment outcomes than other classes, go and find out what's happening in that room. How can you best support that member of staff to make sure that they're supporting their children the best way? Do they need something else? Is there something else that those children need to support them? How do leaders and staff use this information about children's progress to improve teaching? Well, exactly that. We're going to look at that pupil progress. We're going to look at the outcomes for children. We're going to look at what other things might be going on for that child so that we can improve our teaching for them as an individual. But we're using as much information as we have about the child to improve our teaching for that child as well. And additional training and support needs to be given to staff who provide support for the weakest readers. That's why I said if you look at your classes and there's one cohort where you've got one class that is further, it's got better GPC knowledge, stronger at blending than another class, go and see what's happening for those pupils. Look at the children in that class. what's the barrier for each of those pupils, and how can you best support the staff delivering the content to those children to make sure that they are getting the best in every single lesson? Is it that maybe you need to teach it at another time of day so that you could send more adults into that room so that children have more targeted support? Is it that you need to have more one-to-one sessions outside of the classroom to meet the needs of those pupils? Or what can you do to support the staff who are delivering the content to those children as well? So then often you've done your piece, you've spoken about ELS, hopefully the inspector's got, sorry, can you just please stop so I can write some of this down, because you've just overwhelmed them with your knowledge of early reading and how well it's being taught in your school and everything that's happening. Then they're going to want to see what's happening. They'll say, let's go and have a look at your lessons. Tell me what we'll see in these lessons. What do you expect to see? They might speak about something that you've already told them about and said, let's go and see that in action. So tell me what you're going to be able to see in these lessons. If you haven't seen phonics teaching, you won't be able to answer this question. If you haven't been released to go and look at teaching, you don't know what's happening in the classrooms. You can't talk authoritatively about it. And you won't know if you've got consistent practice. You won't know if people are following ELS correctly. You won't know if they're using the right terminology or language because you won't have been in. What would you expect the teaching assistant to be doing during the lesson? What does that look like in your school? For us, we want the teaching assistant sat near the front looking at the kids. They are the additional adult in that room to go then and support a child who they've seen maybe needs support with a flashcard review, to go over and support a child who's struggling with decoding and blending. Maybe it's a bit of behaviour management, but whatever it is, I always say to teaching assistants, you have got the hardest job, because when you're the teacher, you're kind of stuck at the front. It's sort of like your show. So it's really, really hard to go then to the back of the classroom to support a child quickly and return to the front. So your teaching assistant is a key part. You know, they're the most expensive resource in your room to support you with teaching. So making use of them, talking to them about which children they've spotted. You know, they might have picked up on a child that you haven't spotted in the lesson. How are you going to support that child? Is it that they need to stay with you in the lesson intervention? Your teaching assistant is your pair of eyes as well. They're there to help you with what's going on with the learning that's taking place, so that you know what is the best course of action in that lesson, but also going forward for the children that you're teaching. How does the lesson fit in with the overview for the subject? Is it what you'd expect to see? Does it match the progression that you're supposed to be teaching? Are they using the correct vocabulary? Do the teachers questioning encourage learning and inquiry? We always say teach, don't test. So if the children are being asked to do something, has it been modelled to them first? Is the teacher's subject knowledge good? Are they speaking about the teaching that's happening? Are they talking about the content of the lesson with authority? Do they know what they're talking about? Have they even things like practiced that oral blending? You know, have they looked at the words that are coming up in the lesson? If there are words where there's no image to help them with their teacher definition, have they thought about the explanation for the language that they might meet within the lesson? Things like, you know, when you've got to put your word into a sentence, have they practiced that sentence before? Is it a high quality sentence? Are they modelling good practice? And are the children learning new knowledge and skills? And if not, what's the teacher doing? Are they then putting them in the lesson intervention? Or are they going, hang on a second, let's do that again. Let me model that for you. I've picked up on the fact that you haven't done that. Let's go back and do this again together. So thinking about what's taking place, you know, that story of the learning that you see on the children's faces, that's where we're going to find out what's happening. Are they learning? Are they engaged? Are they participating? Are they attending to the lesson? Is every child participating in that phonics lesson, understanding what you want them to do? And if not, are they then being supported to make sure that there are no gaps? So in other questions, these are ones that might be asked to your wider teaching staff as well, and why it's so important that every single member of staff can answer these. When do you start teaching the children letter sound correspondences? So this is in the first few weeks of primary. I would suggest it's week 2, as I've already said. You do not want to wait until you've completed the baseline assessment, because it tells us that we shouldn't. There's also lots of other places where it tells you that it needs to start within the first few weeks of primary. I did go through and look. I found about 8 different places where it told us in all the different frameworks and guidance and the inspection framework and handbook and the EYFS guidance that we should be teaching it from the first few weeks, because number one, it's really difficult and there's a lot to teach and we've got to get going. And number 2, we've got to work out really quickly who are the children that are going to find it harder, so we can make sure that we're supporting them from the off. How many sounds will your pupil be able to read at the end of each term? Know the progression. You know, have a rough idea of how many weeks of teaching there is. You know, if there's 5 solid weeks of teaching and we're teaching 4 graphemes a day, you know that it's going to be 20 at the end of that half term. But know how many sounds are going to be read. Where are the children up to at this point of the year? That's where you can have that progression. Which children aren't at this point? And that's up to the teachers to know where their pupils are. It's part of the reason why ELS is a whole class teaching model, is because when you don't teach all of your children, number one, you actually don't know where all your children are. So it's impossible to help them. And often you don't get to have a catch up after the phonics lesson because it's the middle of the day. So you might touch base with the teacher at the end of the day if you're lucky, but it doesn't mean that you've been able to do anything about it for the other 4 hours you've had the kid in front of you where they've got a gap that you can't close. So that's one of the best parts of having a whole class teaching model. And they will ask you questions about your phonics program being a whole class teaching model. Number one, you know where all your kids are. Number two, you know which gaps you've got to close. Number three, you can be reactive to the teaching. You can support those pupils who are finding it hardest in that classroom. And they're getting that teaching from you, the expert. You're an expert in them. You're an expert in teaching reading, and they're getting that first intervention with you, that expert, in their classroom. And they're seeing their teacher, they're with their peers. We know there is so much evidence and research out there about pupils who are finding it harder to learning with their peers, and that's strengthening and developing their understanding. So there are so many reasons why. And also, like, I don't want to differentiate you out in my classroom. I wouldn't do it in my science lesson. I wouldn't send you out for a different PE lesson. That's just ridiculous. I wouldn't send you off to go and do a different history lesson or an art lesson. Why on earth am I going to send you out of the room to go and do a different phonics lesson, which is the most important thing I'm teaching you every day, teaching you to read to access the curriculum. And how do you assess learning? Everybody should be able to talk about the fact that you assess in week 5. The reason why we assess in week 5 is because if I assess you in week 6, now I know where your gap is, but you've gone on or you've gone on your Christmas holidays and I can't do anything about it. So I'm assessing you in week 5 and I've now got a whole week where I can do something about it. And if I'm really strategic about how I assess you, I'll assess my weakest children first, because then I've got the longest period of time to do anything about it. If I assess you on the Monday of week 5 and it's a 6-week half term, I've now got 9 teaching days where I can close those gaps. So I'm going to think about this strategically so that I can assess the learning, not just in the lesson, not just at all the different points within the lesson, but then when I am assessing the learning on a half termly basis, I'm then thinking strategically about how to enact what I'm finding in those assessment outcomes for pupils. So now we're going to look at some reports. I've taken 2 comments from random reports. These both follow ELS. And when I say random, I can't even tell you the names of the schools. I literally did just pick them at random. I just picked an outstanding Ofsted report and I picked a good Ofsted report. They're relatively new. That's the only thing I can tell you. We're going to look at them both. This is the outstanding comment first, and then we're going to pull this comment apart. This is something that we do. So I said at the beginning, you go through all of this. It's obviously, it can feel extremely like you're under a lot of pressure because you've got these 2 days where people come to school and you've got to show everything that you do. But hopefully by the virtue of the fact that I had to speak really quite quickly, none of what I've already said was personalised to your place of work and your children. And I've spoken for 45 minutes about just how ELS matches all of those questions that I've been through. Hopefully you can speak and attest to even more of what happens in your setting. But these are what we get as an Ofsted comment. It's usually 6 or 7 sentences and it talks about a variety of things. And now I'm going to pick these 2 apart so you can see the different things that they are summarising within your report. So this report comment says, reading is prioritised for all pupils. Staff are highly trained to deliver the agreed phonics programme from the reception year onwards. Pupils practice reading using books that closely match the sounds they are learning. This helps pupils to become fluent and confident readers. Staff expertly support these pupils who find reading more difficult. And these pupils typically catch up with their peers. Across the school, pupils develop a love for reading. They read widely and often and eagerly discuss a wide range of authors and literature. So let's look at this first comment here. This first sentence is this whole school approach to the teaching of early reading. Reading is prioritised for all pupils. Or you might find a comment that says, reading is at the heart of everything this school does. That is where what you want your Ofsted inspector to take, or what you want whoever is coming to look at your practice to take, is what this whole school approach to the teaching of reading is. So you might want to make a note of how you would summarise your whole school approach to the teaching of reading. Could be that reading is prioritised. It could be that it's a heart of everything that you do. And then what I want you to do after this is to go away and think of all the ways you can prove that to be the case. What can you say? What do you do in your school? How can you make sure that whoever is looking at your practice can see that you've prioritised the teaching of reading to every single child in that school? Whether it's thinking about what's happening in your early years or children in Key Stage 2, whether it's thinking about how you're looking at the wider reading curriculum, children, are they visiting your library if you have one? How are you showing that it's been prioritised? I've already spoken earlier on some things like training, timing, resourcing, attending to the lesson. How are you making sure that it's prioritised in your building for all children? So that whole school approach to the teaching of reading. The next line is often about training and delivery. Staff are highly trained to deliver the agreed phonics programme from the reception year onwards. Or I read other comments that say things like, teachers are experts in the teaching of early reading. How are you going to show, both through what you say when you're speaking about what you've done to implement ELS within your school, but equally when you then go into the classrooms, the practice sessions, the observations, the coaching, all of the support that you have put in place as the reading lead, how are you going to show and evidence and prove that your staff are highly trained? How do you know they're highly trained? What have you put in place? What have they all done to be trained? So how are you in one sentence? What's your one sentence training and delivery? All the different things that go into having this one sentence. It's not just, yeah, they've all done the training. There are so many parts that make this sentence true. And it can be the practice, it can be the review, it can be looking at data, it can be agreeing what next steps will be. There are so many elements to training your staff to deliver the programme well, to deliver the programme with fidelity. But think carefully about how you have trained to make sure that the delivery of the programme is exemplar within your building. The next comment we've got is pupils practice reading using books that closely match the sounds they are learning. So texts matched to their current phonic knowledge. How do you know they're matched? What are the teachers doing? What have you supported them? How have you supported them to know how to match those pupils' texts? Are the children having those texts read with them? Number one will be that you've got books and that you've matched them to the curriculums, i.e. you've put them in the order of the progression, that those books are clearly labelled, that everybody who is going to give out books knows how to use that labelling system. When we introduced it to one of our schools, I made posters. So it said, this is what you need to look at. This is how you're then going to find the book. And this is what it should look like when you're giving the child the book. This is what a book that is matched to their phonic reading will look like. We've got little labels, the stickers that you can print off Oxford Owl. This is how you know which week it is. This is how you know which term it's in. This is how you know if it is matching their phonic knowledge, if they're up to date. And if you're giving them a fluency book, how to choose a fluency book in addition, if that's what you're doing. So thinking even about the preparation for those things, are they all matched? Do the pupils, can they access them independently? And how do you know? What are you using to inform that knowledge? The next statement is this helps pupils to become fluent and confident readers. So it's an outcome statement here. How do you know pupils are confident and fluent readers? What do you have to evidence that? Pupil voice, do you get feedback? Have you looked at assessment outcomes? Do you know what your outcomes are at Key Stage 1, looking into Key Stage 2? How are you sure that what you're doing is producing these fluent, confident readers? Are they reading at an age-related expectation? Are they exceeding age-related expectations? Looking at your Key Stage 1 data for pupils meeting the expected standard for reading, are your pupils meeting that standard? Are they fluent and confident readers? What have you got to show? How can you be sure? Think about this in your setting. How can you evidence that this is happening? And what can you then expect to see when you're going into your classrooms? How can you make sure that you're showing this? Staff expertly support those pupils who find reading more difficult, and these pupils typically catch up with their peers. This is a comment, and there's always a comment about supporting the lowest 20% and your least able readers. How do you know that they're doing this? What have you put in place? ELS has given you the in-lesson intervention. It's given you the vocabulary knowledge and understanding through all the imagery that's there to support those pupils. It's given you the apply activity sheet so you can see what's going on, typically in those first few weeks of reception, but you've also got those one-to-one interventions so you can make sure that you are supporting those pupils and that staff know how to support those pupils. You can use the training, you can use the resources. We've given you word banks in the handbook. There's lots of stuff at your disposal to support you in creating an environment which makes sure that all children catch up. And then this final part, across the school, pupils develop a love for reading. They read widely and often and eagerly discuss a wide range of authors and literature. And this talks about your wider school setting. How can you have one sentence, two sentences here that sums up the wider reading attitude to children? So this is then thinking about your reading curriculum, how it links to your wider curriculum, how often the children engage. How can you show that pupils develop a love of reading? How can you show, and in the next one it talks about adults' attitudes to reading, how can you show this in classrooms without even saying anything? Is there evidence as you walk into the room that this is a classroom where reading is prioritised, where reading is engaged with, where the pupils love reading, but the teacher fosters a love of reading for their children? So we've been through the 5 parts of this comment, and now I'm going to look at the next one. This is a good comment. So this is a report that was good with outstanding features. And this one says, the school has made teaching pupils to read an absolute priority. Staff teach phonics expertly. Any pupil who falls behind with phonics is quickly identified. Staff give pupils precise additional support to keep up with the programme. Adults' enthusiasm for reading inspires pupils. From nursery onwards, children love listening to stories and joining in with songs and rhymes. Pupils talk about their favourite books and authors with genuine enthusiasm, and they enjoy visiting the school's brand new library. Older pupils know a range of poetry off by heart, performing them well with gestures, expression and clear intonation. So there's a little bit more going on in this comment. I've broken it down again. Again, this first comment is about this whole school approach to the teaching of reading. Teaching pupils to read an absolute priority. How can you prove, how can you show that's the case in your school? What do you do? What do your teachers say? What will your pupils say to make sure that you can prove that reading is a priority? I've said lots of things already. So for you to think about how that whole school approach to the teaching of reading is prioritised and how you can evidence that, how you can show it in your practice. Again, training and delivery. Staff teach phonics expertly. How do you know? What have you done? How are you supporting them to be experts? How can you prove that they're experts? You can prove it with the data. You can prove it with what's going on in the classroom. You can prove it with the practice that you've seen. You can prove it because you've practiced together. There are so many things that you can say and show to prove that you know that they're teaching it expertly well. And one of those things will be about supporting that lowest 20% and the least stable readers. It's here again. Pupils who fall behind are quickly identified and staff give precise additional support to keep up with the programme. It's really clear, targeted. That's going to support you in showing that you're teaching it expertly. Here's one about inspiring a love of reading. Adults' enthusiasm for reading inspires pupils. From nursery onwards, children love listening to stories and joining in with songs and rhymes. That attests to that wider reading culture that's going on in the school that's here, the wider school setting. Pupils talk about their favourite books and authors with genuine enthusiasm, enjoy visiting the school's brand new library. Older pupils know a range of poetry off by heart, performing them well with gestures, expression and clear intonation. Whatever you do in that wider school setting, what can you say? How can you show? Where is it planned in your curriculum? What will your children be doing? Where can you show this to an inspector? How can you evidence that this is happening? You know, I've broken it down into these key points for you here. In that comment, that 6 or 7 sentences that summarises that deep dive into early reading, you've got to think about how you are showing that whole school approach. How you are evidencing the training and then the delivery of that programme in your classrooms. How you can show through everything that we've already said and through what you're going to see in the classrooms, in your data, through pupil voice potentially, through what your teachers say, how you are supporting the lowest 20% and your least able readers. How you are inspiring a love of reading, both through what you might see happening and verbally in the classrooms, talking about literature, but equally what's happening in your book corners, what's happening in your classroom. Do children have books? Are they engaged with your library? Does your book corner, if you've got one in your classroom, does it inspire a love of reading? Are there high quality texts? Are those texts matched to your curriculum? Are they engaging? Are they age appropriate? Think about all the other elements, all the things that you might be doing that are going to support inspiring a love of reading. And then finally thinking about that wider school setting. You know, how does not just early years think about early reading, but how does the whole school view reading? How does it show that it's a priority? What is it doing to maintain children's interest? And we see that children are becoming less engaged with reading for pleasure. Think about why that is. You know, I attribute quite a lot of this to devices as a device hater myself. It's much more fun to go and sit home and play on a Nintendo or whatever device than it is necessarily to read a book. But so how are we fostering that love of reading? What are we doing? How are we inspiring children to pick up books? How are we engaging them? How are we making them view themselves as a reader in that wider school setting? What knowledge are we giving them? What authors are we introducing them to? And that all comes back to planning that really rich, engaging curriculum for the children as well, so that they do have this wide range of texts that they're exposed to, that can draw them in, that can engage them, that can inspire them. So thinking really carefully about how, if you take nothing else, although I've just spoken for nearly a whole hour about this, if you take nothing else, think about these 5 statements here. How can you show that your school is doing all of these? What do you do? When we've done this with Katie and I, when we've spoken to staff members about it and people that we've worked with in the past, we've taken comments from Ofsted reports. We've taken these kind of threads that I've pulled here. And then we have literally annotated all around it what we're doing to show these things. And that then helps us to answer some of those questions at the beginning. And that then helps us to think about what we want to show when somebody walks into our school. Doesn't matter who they are. I want people to come out of classrooms going, oh my God, the children love reading. It's been taught expertly well. I think one of my proudest days was bringing the ELS trainers, when we did our first training session ever, bringing them to our school and showing them our phonics lessons. And they walked out, one of this group of teachers walked out into the playground and they just started laughing because they could not believe how well the children were doing. They looked at their books when they were in the room, they were reading the writing of the children. They couldn't believe what a massive impact this reading curriculum that Katie and I had written had had on the children, and how the outcomes for these children were, even to these trainers whose schools do astronomically well, that their outcomes for the children were evident. You could see all of these things from the way that they spoke about reading when they were asking them, but equally from what they saw of the teaching. And they were just walking out into the playground laughing because they just couldn't believe how amazing what they'd seen. And that wasn't anything we told them. We'd literally just said, this is what we're going to go and see. But it was visible. All these things are visible. And then we talked about all of these things at length with them and discussed them in great detail. I'm aware that there are probably some questions. I haven't.
Yeah, there are. Can we do there's been a couple of really good questions,
okay.
And it would be great to answer them. So first of all, we've got one that asked, because there's such a focus on outcomes, what would you do with a cohort that are heavily SEND? So we've got, in this example, we've got 6 out of 30. So 4 with EHCPs and 2 are waiting. So how would you show those outcomes?
It depends on the pupils that you have in your class. For those pupils, it might be that if they need that information twice, or if they need that information chunked up over the day, so we're slowing it down in terms of breaking the lesson up into smaller chunks. It's knowing your kids and delivering the curriculum to them. It might be that they have profound needs that are going to prevent them from keeping up with 4 sounds a week, and that actually the best thing for those pupils might be that they are taught on a slow progression in a smaller group. And that's where you being the experts in your kids and having the ownership of that decision, because you know what's best for them, is the best thing to do, is to really think about that. But if you want to get in touch with me on our ELS email, which I don't know if I've got it on our slides, I actually don't think I do. If you want to get in touch with us, els@ks-t.org, and talk to me about what's going on with these pupils, I might be able to support you in a bit more depth, or we might have schools who have other things that I can kind of point you in the direction of. We do have a massive ELS pilot in specialist settings, and some of those settings teach the programme exactly as it's intended and still get the same outcomes. I'm now going through the question chat box.
So yeah, we've got another question which I've answered, but I know you will answer it better. So this is an inspection where the inspector didn't like the activity books. They didn't understand why they were reading text rather than just single words with the GPCs in. And I've answered this very briefly because I know you'll have very strong opinions on this. And that they thought that the passages should be personalised for the children. And then also that the inspector wasn't keen that the teacher was doing something on the carpet with the children that needed that extra support, and not observing what was being done with the apply activities.
I can also see what programme this inspector did like.
Yes.
And inspectors are not allowed to show a preference. So that's the first thing. So they're actually not allowed to show a preference. What they're allowed to do is question your practice. That's their job. That's why they're there. They want to find out what's happening in your school. The texts are matched to the day of teaching. The amount of information that the child might read within that text differs from child to child. That's why we've given you a time limit. And in our training guidance on apply activity books, we spend an awful lot of time talking about how to use them and how you can make sure that you're scaffolding them for the children, how you can make sure that you're reducing the amount of content that you might be asking them to read. But it's there because it's a direct application. It's where the children take ownership of their understanding of what's happening. It's where they take ownership of their learning, and you've modelled it to the children, so they know how to be successful. If the pupils are making errors, then yes, I can understand that might be quite challenging if you're on your own, but we are modelling it to the children, and it's matched to their current phonic knowledge. And if it isn't, those are the children that are in the lesson intervention with you. So, you know, if you're spotting in the class that things aren't, that child does not look like they've got this today, or I can see that they've disengaged, I can see they're not decoding and blending here, I can see that they're not applying their phonic knowledge when they're reading the sentences, that's the time to jump in and keep that child in the lesson intervention. I always say to the teachers in our trust that group should be fluid. If I walk into your classroom 10 days in a row, I don't want to see the same children in that group over that 10 day, unless you can prove to me that they need to be there. Because sometimes it might be another person that needs to come because on that day they didn't get it. You know, it might be this group of children have got gaps, so they need to be there with you. But there might be other children that on a day-to-day basis, you know, learning is not linear. You know, on a day-to-day basis, there might be other children that need to be involved in that. But in terms of inspections, you are not allowed to show a preference as an inspector. Oh, that's lovely that somebody else has come back and said that they've had 3 inspections and the ELS was a huge strength. Very tough inspection, even though we got the result we wanted and deserved. Well, I'm really glad that you did. But yeah, if you ever have somebody, you know, and this is going to be shared more widely than just the 51 people here, but if Ofsted is in your building and they ask you something and you think, I don't know what the answer to that is, just send us an email and put Ofsted in capital letters as your subject line, and you will get a reply pretty quickly from hopefully Katie or I, because we want to help you. And if you are being challenged on something and you think, hang on a second, that completely differs to the ELS ethos, tell us what is being said, because we can tell you what the phrasing is. And I said in our reading leader training, if you came to London the other day, or if you come to the next one, I do contact Ofsted and I do contact the Department for Education, and I do challenge them on things that people are told in their inspections, and then I make them write statements for me that I can provide you with, that you can then send if you get a draft report and you're not happy with a comment made about something. I make them write things down, so I have it in writing from the Department for Education or from Ofsted what the expectation is or what the comment is that they are allowed to make. Because I have to know I will die on the hill defending you guys. So if you need help, email us. But equally, if you think something that's being said isn't right, tell me what's being said and I will go and challenge it, and I will keep going until I get an answer, and I will get it in writing. And I have in the past given the name of a school to Ofsted, kind of the administrative side of it, to make sure that the report actually reflects the correct information. So I am, you know, Katie and I are always on your side. So if you need help, please do get in touch with us. I can see that you've answered that question.
I think that's all the questions. Yes, your answer was much better, but I thought I'd put it in writing as well. So yes, that's all the questions. Thank you so much. It was really, really useful and really interesting. And thank you everyone for joining. You'll see that the Facebook group is in the chat, and the email address that Tara was mentioned is also in the chat there. So if you do have any further questions from this, then let us know. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Bonne chance.